we will begin with the third session. The first speaker for the third session is Marian Tataru. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. She is a PhD student in philosophy at the West University of Timisoara. He is currently working on his doctoral thesis discussing the role of philosophical counseling in the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of the people who suffered criminal conviction. Welcome to the meeting, and please present your screen and start your presentation, sir. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you this evening. The first of all, I want to share with you an information that came to me 10 minutes ago. From yesterday in Romania, officially and legally, the philosophical counselor is a profession. It took 3 years for, we have an NGO, which gathers philosophical counselors and people who are working in this field, and we succeeded to make the state to recognize this philosophical counselor as a profession. I have a BA, a philosophical BA. I have a master's degree in philosophical counseling, which is in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe. It's one of a kind, this program. And now, because we have that kind of academical background, we succeed to make the state to recognize us as a profession. This evening, I don't have slides. I try to interrogate if the philosophical counselor or philosophical counseling could be a complementary method suitable for rehabilitating and reintegrating former detainees. The purpose of this paper is to present an argument in favor of using philosophical counseling as a way of intervening in the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of the person who suffered criminal conviction with custodial sentences. Relatively new to the family of correctional counseling methods, philosophical counseling could be relevant in the programs aimed at reintegration of former detainees. Philosophical counseling can provide the client with cognitive restructuring tool to support emotional homeostasis and thus prevent decision with serious consequences for the individual. Philosophical counseling, in my opinion, can help troubled person to balance the way he reasons and the way he manages his emotional stress. I will talk in the Romanian context, and I will give you some statistical data to understand what is the need of philosophical counseling. And these statistical data are from 3 years ago, 4 years ago, in fact, and like that in 2017, there were 20,000 person in units of the system of national administration of penitentiary. In 2018, in the end of the March, there were 22,000 people in the same units. Yeah, in January 2019, were 20,000. In conclusion, according to the official data provided by NAP, in 2 years, the number of persons deprived of liberty in Romania penitentiary decreased by almost 7,000. Citing a statistic made by Romanian Ministry of Justice, we found out that between October 2017 and November 2019, 13,000 detainees were released based on the provision of law on the compensatory appeal. From these 13,000, almost 700 or back in the prison in a month. The Federation of Trade Unions of Romania National Administration of Penitentiary predicts that in a period of 1 to 3 years, almost 14,000 beneficiaries of compensatory appeal, over 70% will relapse. In conclusion, about 10,000 offenders will most likely return to prisons to serve their new sentences. Returning for the time being to the 700 detainees who already have been convicted of recidivism in the last year, we noted that the range of crimes committed by them is different from the common set to very serious crimes such as rape or robbery or murder. So metaphorically speaking, all habits are hard to cure, especially when there is no treatment that effectively supports healing. And I'm not talking about people's cure, old people's cure. Unfortunately, it's easy to guess that without timely intervention, the condition will progress to chronicity, doubled by exacerbation of the certain systems. In this case, could be a violent crime. It is obvious that such a forecast presented by Ministry of Justice, in which an estimated percent of 70 recurrence in maximum 3 years, apart from the fact that it gives you a cold shower down your spine, makes you wonder rationally what are the causes of such phenomenon and how it could be combated. It should be noted that there are, and I'm not cautioning the opportunity of law on compensatory appeal, but rather I'm interested in the springs that determine such a high percentage of former detainees to relapse. And here I do not take into account the simplistic explanations such as inside in penitentiary is much better than outside in freedom, because the Romanian prisons offer keeping the proportion a hotel accommodation regime, because inside they have the impression that they are also someone when they are nobody outside, because it's winter. I'm also interested whether repeat offenders consider themselves morally responsible for the acts committed, or whether they provide a rational justification for criminal conduct. Going back to the causes, no doubt there are many circumstantial and not infrequently combined and related to a personal history of individuals who end up in such life situation. Simply put, the cases are before and after the commission of crimes, conviction, and detention. The simplest schemes, perhaps vitiated by a prejudice of mind, highlights a cocktail composed of dysfunctional families, low or no existent education, the absence of a decent living condition, and the need to survive in a hostile environment. It is not difficult to intuit that all this creates a framework that favors, for some of the members of the community, the initial choice, but also those related to recidivism. In a way, these causes are both ante and post, but there are also causes related to the community ability to support former detainees to rehabilitate and socially reintegrate. It's a common thing for some of those who are freed to have nowhere to return after detention because their family are broken or repudiated them on their own initiative or under social pressure from a neighboring community. In fact, even if it is not politically correct to say such thing, we can say that there is quite a bit of hypocrisy when it comes to rehabilitating and reintegrating former offenders into society. Yes, there is no doubt in when it comes to in the community there are forms in which we are assured that there is life after detention for former offenders. But there are reintegration programs that facilitate the recovery of people who have broken the law. But not infrequently, these forms are unfounded because the community as a whole is rejecting them after then supporting them. Former detainees are viewed with suspicion and are isolated from the rest of society after being isolated through detention. For example, many of them find it difficult to find a job, being the victims of exaggerated precautions that some of the employers in the community have regarding them. Obviously, the precautions are doubled by the fact that many of them have no professional qualification and do not have easy access to adult education or training programs. The causes, of course, are much more and more complex, and their analysis is subject of many specialized work, which is not the case here. I'd like to make one distinction regarding the cases which have as their effect a difficult process of rehabilitation and reintegration of a person with criminal record. There are a number of cases which we may call external because they are related to factors beyond the control of the individual. And they depend very much on the socio-economic context of the environment from which they come. Access to decent living condition, education, functional families, safe and supportive communities. Another category of causes could be internal ones and would question the emotional and cognitive components of the individual. In this text, I have used the metaphor of all habits that are difficult to heal if the correct treatment is not administrated, but it would add in the healing process that there are some adjuvant components that should be taken into account. The desire, will to need to understand, and the perseverance of the individual to fight what he is facing. Undoubtedly, when you are engaged in the fight against something, it would be very helpful to understand, to internalize, to clarify what that something you are fighting against is. Currently, in Romania penitentiary system, the counseling component called assistance in official documents is generally psychological or refers to individual life living skills, even if it exists. Being included in National Strategy of Social Reintegration of Private Person of Freedom, approved. This national strategy is insufficient, especially due to the staffing schemes in penitentiary that have too small a number of professionals allocated for the prison population. For example, at the level of services for detainees facing psychological problem who need psychotherapy, this would not be possible because this type of intervention is missing in prison or is very rare at best. Certainly, psychological assistance or assessment is not the same as a therapeutic intervention. It is true that this type of interventions are often piloted through the specific projects funded by European funds who are carried out by a non-governmental organization in Romania, but they are a drop in an ocean compared to the prison population from Romanian prison. Officially, I don't know if there are statistics for the people in prison who suffer from depression or anxiety, for example. As a first conclusion of this paper is the fact that tries to present a set of premises on which to base a plea in favor of philosophical counseling as a method of supporting the process of rehabilitation and social reintegration of the people with criminal backgrounds. I can say that through Socratic dialogue, philosophically it can provide the individual with an instrument of analysis of internal causes of the cognitive or emotional substratum that is or has been the basis for committing a crime. To say that philosophical counseling is a relatively new method in the family of various forms of psychological or psychotherapeutic counseling that are person-centered and aimed at improving general condition, especially psychological or of the individual, is false. To say about philosophical counseling is or can be an adjunct to establish the counseling methods that aim to correct the way of the individual reasons is wrong. To say about philosophical counseling that it aims to provide solution the life problems of a person in an existential crisis is just as wrong, etc. Why? For the simple reason that you can say that all the methods mentioned above are in fact based on philosophical advice. Socratic dialogue, maieutic as a technique of interacting dialogically with the person who has a dilemma, and who is looking for the answers needed for a solution was patented long before any centered therapeutic approach. The fact that Socratic dialogue remained in a field of anecdote or as an object of a study in academic philosophy until 1980s does not in any way diminish its value as a method of probing the dialectical way in which one is able to analyze a problem with that facing. In fact, philosophical counseling has seen unprecedented development in the last 30 years, becoming in many countries, USA, Northern Europe, Germany, UK, France, as an independent profession with representatives, organizations, and leading authors recognized in terms of the world. An inventory of areas in which philosophical counseling has become a used method proves that it is increasingly seen as a practical solution to addressing a wide range of existential or other problems that individuals face throughout their lives. It's equally important to note that at the education level, philosophical counseling has seen unprecedented development through the philosophy for children or with children programs whose main objective is to develop the disposition and skills of critical thinking, especially of students up to the second cycle of education. Recalling the areas in which philosophical counseling is currently used, we cannot omit the fact that this, even if on a smaller scale, is a method that has penetrated the penitentiary space of reset programs, being considered a solution to in the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of persons who have committed crimes and are deprived of liberty, suspended, or on probation. Quoting Vaughan Fury, a philosophical counselor from America involved in rehabilitation and reintegration programs implemented in prisons in Canada and in the United States, you can say that one of the objectives of the practice of philosophical counseling is primarily the transfer of a set of competencies, critical thinking to inmates through peer-to-peer counseling session. I will simply use the term rehabilitation to refer any programs or techniques used in the process of promoting or restoring the skills needed to lead a life with a minimum of success outside an institution. An offender is duly considered rehabilitating if there is evidence that he or she has such power. I quoted Vaughan Fury. In Vaughan Fury view, the acquisition of or latency of critical thinking skills can be considered a serious premise for the moral recovery of the subject of philosophical counseling. In this case, a person with criminal history. In Fury's opinion, moral responsibility is the cornerstone of rehabilitation of a person who suffered the criminal conviction, given that this person internalizes the moral dimension of the guilt or deed committed. At the same time, the American author believes through calibrated philosophical counseling to stimulate the skills and the dispositions of critical thinking, in addition to the fact that the subject reconsiders his moral position towards the deed committed. Other beneficial effects may appear, such as reconsideration of predisposition on the direction of action without initial reflection on the consequences, reacquiring the ability to assess the consequences of action of logical reasoning, reacquiring an overview of particular situation, reconsidering simplistic or illogic excuses, giving up justification on facts by blaming others as a possible causes for the crimes committed, cognitive flexibility transported by the ability to appreciate alternatives that avoid forms of bigotry based on inflexible belief system, cognitive altruism translated by the ability to differentiate personal thoughts and emotion from those of other people, doubled by the tendency of empathically interpret the action of others, thus creating conciliatory premises for relationships. In the literature for penitentiary correction, counselors, such as some of the internal causes identified as the triggers for committing or justifying crimes, are defined as thinking errors motivated by certain type of emotional stress. In view of this, it seems to me justified for philosophical counseling session to focus on the client's cognitive component in order to provide him a tool for analyzing how he reasons and whether he is actually prepared to do so impartially without prejudice. Reason and the way it is used, of course, involves the development of specific types of skills and competencies such as problem-solving skills, the ability to plan for the future, the ability to empathize with others, flexibility in thinking to be open to as many interpretations as possible, to accept and to take responsibility and to anticipate the consequences for our action. Normally, this should be the next step that the philosophical advisors should propose to the client. It should not be overlooked that everything related to the cognitive component sums up not only the way we reason and the attitudes, beliefs, values of the individual, but also the way he relates to everything around him. Through philosophical counseling, certain errors of thoughts can be cancelled out, and the way we reason can be restructured in this way, changing the content of beliefs, values, and attitudes. Philosophical counseling can resize in this way, the way in which, from the moral point of view, the individual will assume responsibility for the deeds committed. Therefore, the rehabilitation of persons who have suffered criminal conviction should be linked and the idea of moral and the acquisition of critical thinking skills necessary for rational decision making. This will make the method of counseling easy and perhaps useful in the process of social reintegration. Critical thinking skills associated with moral responsibility can serve as a basis for building an intervention scheme that could be considered the preparation of philosophical counseling session with person deprived of their liberty. Without exaggerating the virtues of philosophical counseling as a supporting method in the process of rehabilitating people with criminal history, we can say that one of the indicators that can verify effectiveness of this tool is the low recurrence score of people going through the philosophical counseling programs. Even if I did not set out to demonstrate here how philosophical counseling can have measurable effects on recidivism, non-recidivism for people receiving this type of support, I would not conclude this passage without mentioning other skills needed in the process, making rational decisions that can be developed following philosophical counseling session. We should recognize in them as many arguments for strengthening a preventive dimension as an educational dimension in the process of reintegration and rehabilitation. Acquiring the knowledge needed to recognize and manage any problem or disease that may affect rational behavior. This type of problems include a whole range of psychiatric and psychological disorders, psychosis, neurosis, personality disorders, along with addiction involving drugs and alcohol. At the same time, competencies should include recognizing difficulties in managing stress, anger, or recognizing psychological factors such as denial, projection, introjection that may also affect rational thinking. Develop critical thinking skills, developing critical skills that include skills of identification and formulation of problem, accounting and evaluation of relevant facts, to differentiate between facts and opinions, processing of acquired information, to identify alternatives and consequences, to detect errors in one's reasoning as well as the reasoning of others, acquisition and practical learning of minimal social skills doubled by the assumption that we live in a world with others who think, feel, communicate differently, and that these differences must be understood and respected. Appropriate by controlling impulsivity and cultivating sufficient self-discipline to meet chosen goals to be achieved. The development of the ability to reason morally must support the decision to choose the system of beliefs and values without neglecting the existing alternatives. Affirmation of personal identity in which respect for oneself is solid in the face of external pressures. Equally important, it seems to me that through philosophical counseling, individuals can be helped to critically examine their own belief system and values, which often include the belief that they have been subjected to abuse, economic inequality, and racism may be invoked as an excuse for or as a justification for the offense committed. It also helps to critically explore the belief that imprisonment is a title of glory that indicates an act of folly against an unjust system. Returning to the central theme of this paper, I must point out that it coagulates a number of arguments in favor of the thesis that by philosophical counseling, an individual with a criminal past can be rehabilitated and reintegrated in the community as a morally responsible member. Moral responsibility presupposes that people with a criminal history reposition themselves in their relation with the community to which they belong by accepting penance, not as something imposed from outside, but as something assumed. In this sense, the punishment should not be perceived as a currency of exchange between two parties in which the punished and the punisher accept the conviction as a social convention. I was legally wrong, so I deserve to be convicted. Emptied of moral content, but as something that has primarily an ethical dimension, which presupposes that relational coordinate between the individual and the community to which he belongs. Acknowledging that you are wrong in relation to the community you belong, accepting the punishment should mean, first of all, that you understand the moral dimension of deed committed. Acknowledgement of guilt should be the result of a process of interpretation, analysis, evaluation, logic, explanation, and last but not least, the capacity for self-criticism. Of course, this whole process cannot take place in its fullness as long as the one engaged it does not show that he is oriented towards the search of truth, that he has an open mind and is flexible in thinking, that he has a predisposition to analysis and systematicity, that he has confidence in himself, that he is mature in thinking. Undoubtedly, the attributes mentioned above are in fact an enumeration of skills and dispositions necessary for critical thinking process. In conclusion, assuming moral responsibility for our action does not mean that we mechanically accept a convention, but we are engaged in a critical deliberation of the reason for which we are morally responsible. This can be facilitated by the philosophical advisor that provides the right ground for creating the necessary premises to start the process of critical thinking. The following can be stimulated through philosophical counseling session: ability to discuss the subject, ability to distinguish error of reasoning, ability to develop a point of view with clarity, precision, ability to analyze complex issues and arguments, the ability to think independently and creatively think out of the box, ability to build solid and rigorous demonstration. I would not conclude this paper without pointing out, I must admit from a subjective perspective, the reason why I consider that the use of philosophical counseling as a method of support in the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of people who suffer criminal conviction is one that deserves its place among the other methods of psychological or other counseling methods. In this sense, the argument I make is more intuitive and is based on the following assumption. As long as all other methods of counseling apply to provide support to persons with criminal conviction in the process of rehabilitation and reintegration prior to release, implicitly also in that to avoid recurrence, are not 100% effective, we can conclude that the use of other methods aimed to the same purpose is justified and should be at least tried. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that unique topic and unique perspective on philosophical counseling. And thank you for pointing out also that you need to humanize offenders as well, because we need to consider them just as people, as much as as we consider others in the world as equal to us, because even they are persons. And while that's hard, it's something that we need to imbibe and inculcate in our own perspective. So we're open for the question answer round. Whoever has a question, please type in question in the chat box and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Maria Tillmans, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm a little confused, and maybe you can help to explain. It sounds like there is there's a strong burden or a strong sense of responsibility on the individual, the particular inmate, incarcerated inmate. And I was struck by what you said at some point where, you know, many may feel they belong inside and not outside. And I'm wondering, yesterday I actually joined a webinar and there were 4 speakers, and this was a webinar on social justice, who actually emphasized the quote unquote other side, where the social system is unjust and could need philosophical counseling, in fact, because laws and policies do have a way of excluding some people. So how would the individual who feels excluded and as a result might commit crime, and who feels more included within prison as opposed to outside of prison, how do we help them to rehabilitate without them forcing them to adjust to a system that is inherently unjust and unjust to them, perhaps? Now, I'm not looking to either blaming the victim or putting all the burden. We have to, on society, we have to find a way to navigate both, of course. But to overemphasize the individual and their lack of thinking may not be fair when there are also laws and policies outside that put them at a disadvantage to begin with. Thanks.
In my opinion, it takes two for rehabilitating and reintegration the person who suffered the criminal conviction, because if the community is not doing anything in direction of criminal offenders, he will feel that he's isolated. He was isolated inside, and when he is finished doing his time, it's isolated outside. So if in a idealistic community, the community must help the inmate to reintegrate. There are some, I'm not speaking about Romania. There are some projects which are experimenting this type of connecting inmates with community with the role of facilitating the reintegration, like a transition house. Someone who is going outside from the prison is staying there if he has no means to support his life, and with the scope to find a job, to readapt himself to the community.
Right.
But I'm totally agree with you. If we leave the former inmate with this burden of isolation on his shoulder, I think the whole process is initiated by this.
Yeah, thank you.
Mihail, sir, do you have a question?
It's not necessarily a question for Marian, because I know him and I know his work. It's a question if somebody else in here is practicing philosophy in prison.
Yes.
The question is how easy or how hard it is to get in the institution to be able to work with the inmates. Is it clear, my question?
Yes, I could tell you it's almost impossible to go in the prison in this period with coronavirus. And
regardless of coronavirus, before coronavirus?
Well, can I answer?
Please, please.
Well, my husband and I worked, but he at the prison for 5 years. But he was a prison chaplain at that time. And so when I was at the webinar yesterday, there were others who have worked in the prison and worked through the prison chaplain to get into the program, or to get their program into the prison. So that may be a way that you can work with authorities within the prison to, you're not just coming in as an outsider. I was a professor at the university at the time, and they allowed me to come in every 2 weeks to do a group Socratic dialogue with a select group of inmates. And I actually wrote a paper on our experience, but the point you're asking is, how do you get in?
How easy, how many papers do you have to sign? How the procedure, how hard it is? Because in Romania,
well, I guess it's going to be very different.
You have to sign a lot, prepare a dossier. It's hard to get in.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying
and get out when you want.
No, I mean, it's going to differ from country to country, but I think now it's probably even more difficult than when we did it in 2002 to 2007. So I'm sure it's more complicated. And the other issue is that it is important to have someone on the inside that can bring you in. That's my answer.
I have something to contribute, if I may. I did work in a prison as a consultant for nearly 2 years. And to be honest with you, it was merely by coincidence that I was able to get into the prison. There were no, at the prison that I was working at, a jail, I should make clear, there were no people.
Same here,
counseling, because Illinois, the state of Illinois, couldn't afford to pay any counselors. So I was actually the only counselor for about over 1,000 inmates. And I got in because I made friends with the individual who was the head of the medical department in this jail. And so it was quite a coincidence. Otherwise, and then I was made an official Illinois state volunteer, and I went weekly for a number of months and practiced and met with inmates. But I doubt that anybody with just a PhD in philosophy could get into the prisons. I think, as Maria pointed out, I had someone in there who was very, very interested, and they got me in.
Yep.
But other than that, unless you are, if you have a mental health degree or psychiatrist or psychologist, you have better chances of getting into the prison than just with a PhD in philosophy.
Thanks. Thanks, Marian, also for allowing me to put this question in your slot.
There is another question from Dr. Raja. Dr. Raja, could you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting application of philosophical counseling, and I would expect and suspect that it's also a very difficult area, different clientele, or different, just, to put oneself in that space and work in that space and keep one's boundaries and all that. So it's very impressive. I'm wondering, Marian, now that the profession has been recognized, do you see any scope for would it be easier? Could it become easier to work in that space with the profession having been recognized now just 10 minutes ago, or now 40 or whatever it is? I mean, wouldn't that be part of the agenda of the NGO that you were talking about, that there should be these fields in which that there are these fields in which philosophical counseling would be rather productive and constructive on a societal level, and prison education and rehabilitation or prevention of relapse. I mean, that sounds like an excellent area for this kind of thing. So is that something that the NGO that you mentioned has on its agenda? And doesn't that seem to be sort of the way in? Because I think in other countries, philosophical counseling is not, as far as it is in Romania, accepted as a profession the way that it now is in Romania. So it seems like you might even have a good chance to move this forward.
In my opinion, there is a huge advantage to be recognized by state, by government as a profession, because if we have a master degree in philosophical counseling, but it's just a diploma. When you try to start a business as a philosophical counselor, you could be hinged by laws which are not permitting this, because you have to. It was quite interesting because you could be a philosopher, but because the profession wasn't recognized, you couldn't be your philosophical counselor, because it's anomaly. In fact, it was. And yes, if the fields where the philosophical counselor could go are various. Now in Timișoara, do the master program from University of Timișoara. We collaborated a lot with the gymnasial schools, with the high schools, where our students were participating and doing philosophy for children, which is it's okay because you are acknowledged by the community that you could provide something good for community. So the next step is to go in different fields of interest. And if I'm sincere, it's very hard to go in a system which is militarized as penitentiary, and to explain, you need an entrance. You need something who could understand the value of the work you can provide. I think it's a lobby job here. You need results to present. You need data, and yeah, it's very hard to.
Right, and you can only get the data if you get in, right? And so if you don't get in, you can't get the data. So
you could use something like a backdoor. You could work with people which are on probation. It's a form of because the people which are in probation, okay, the majority of them are because of DUI or something like that. But the deal exists. In fact, the broken the law is there, so you could work with them to see if there is really results, and to the next step where to go in prison and to work directly with the people which are suffered conviction for more than DUI. It's quite complicated.
I mean, you would have to conduct a study or something with affiliated with an institution, with a university or something, where you're basically offering this service as a pro bono service to the to the institution that you want to go to. Then it doesn't cost them anything. You can collect your data, publish, and then hopefully sort of raise the awareness, right? Yeah.
It's a form of advertising. In fact, it's very hard to. Because between you as a philosophical counselor and your possible clients, there are a lot of people which are the social, they are psychologists, it's a job for them too. So you have to make yourself valuable to this kind of process. And
thank you, sir. We have another question from Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen?
Yes, thank you so much for your useful discussion. I think it's a very valuable discussion. There's a couple of things. One is a question regarding philosophical counseling being a profession. That implies, does it not, that it's regulated too by the government? I mean, what are the implications of philosophical counseling being a profession in Romania? What is entailed by that?
I don't know what the because it was published yesterday in a journal of newly laws in Romania. I will study. I know that the dossier that our colleagues from NGO used to being certified, but it's. I understand your question being regulated by the state, but it's not something that it's very strict or exclusive or. We will find out what will be the regulation.
Yeah,
there is one.
In the United States, at least, and other countries, no doubt, I'm aware. To be a profession means that there's regulations, by the government, and an attempt to make sure that those who are practicing, within the profession, are competent, to do so. And for instance, in psychotherapy, mental health, there's practicing laws as well as credentialing laws, what you can hang your shingle out as, what you can call yourself literally. So there's practice laws as well as title laws. And that seems to be what usually comes along with the title of being a professional. So this is an interesting case for us to see, because nowhere else has this, to my knowledge anyway, occurred. And it could be a good thing, but we may want to see professional philosophical counseling organizations involved, in the evolution of those standards, so that they don't become too difficult for philosophical practitioners to actually practice without, undue, restrictions, by government. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and I think your presentation is well taken, I think there's already corroboration for those who have worked in prisons. I didn't work in the prison, but I worked with a criminologist many years ago who was utilizing some of my work. And I worked with Sam Zinich too, who spoke recently today with you about his experience getting into the prison system. And we looked at cases of individuals who, were criminally inclined and ended up in prison, and noted that there's some specific types of what in LBT we call syndromes, fallacy syndromes, and a very prominent one was a perfectionism syndrome, with a hedonic demand for perfection, immediate gratification. I must get what I want, immediately. If I don't, it's terrible, horrible, and awful, and I can't stand it. And that has implications for, how, for instance, the use of LBT, and Sam had successfully utilized this on several clients in prison to help them, actually expose these fallacies, in their reasoning, refute them, and utilize virtue-based theory and philosophical antidotes or uplifting philosophies to help them overcome those ideas, and then construct a behavioral plan to practice it so that they can make constructive cognitive and emotional changes. And there's evidence to suggest that that actually works. So when you're talking about making a cognitive shift, making a cognitive change, yeah, there's evidence, that actually can be effective. And so putting these things together, as a profession, and having perhaps a new lease to enter into these contexts such as prisons, utilizing the materials that are available to help to make constructive changes should open up a good deal of open up a new avenue for philosophical counselors to jump in and make constructive changes in prisons and elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. This brings us to the end. This brings us to the second person of the third session, and that is Dr. Luis de Miranda. He works at the Center for Medical Humanities at the Uppsala University in Sweden. I'm sorry. Dr. Luis is a philosopher, historian of ideas, philosophical counselor, and international author of nonfiction and fiction. His books, for example, An Introduction to Artificial Intelligence and Robotics, or the novel Who Killed the Poet, have been translated into 12 languages. Being and Neonness was published by the MIT Press in 2019 and Ensemblance by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. Welcome, sir, and you're welcome to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to meet such a multifarious crowd from all over the world who shares with me this strange practice that indeed, as Elliot was suggesting, has the advantage today of not being fully institutionalized. I mean, there are, of course, advantages in being a profession and being institutionalized, but there is also something quite adventurous and free in what we're doing, and also, of course, perhaps an even greater responsibility. So we'll have a session that is intended to be semi-improvised, because that's the topic of the talk. And the rules of the game, if you accept to play with me, are very simple. I'm going to read the short abstract that I wrote for this presentation. As I read the abstract, I'm going to ask you, those of you who are willing to do so, to write some words that come to your mind as I read. So it could be one word, could be 3 words. It could be a repetition of what I say that really strikes a chord, or a word that is from your own input. So the title is On Destiny and How It Relates to Philosophical Health, an Attuned Improvisation. So philosophical health is the name I'd like to give to the kind of help that we are providing. And there's a network, Philosophical Health International, which I invite you to look at. I will copy the link a bit later. So this intervention will be semi-improvised along the thematic tonality of attuned destiny. Improvisation is an understudied topic in philosophy in general and in philosophical practice in particular. In the context of philosophical counseling and philosophical health, it might be believed that a more reflexive and rationalized form of living might involve less spontaneity. There is a general assumption since Thales that the philosopher is not attentive to present surroundings and lives in the mind, making all sorts of pragmatic or domestic mistakes for lack of attention. More generally, lack of present awareness and daydreaming is sometimes considered a feature of the human species. In the last decades, psychological experiments showing that most of our awakened behavior is performed in a state of semi-consciousness or autopilot have become popular. If our individual destiny is predetermined by the heavens, as it is believed in the religious tradition, or by our genetic, neuronal, or social determinism, as it is believed in multiple scientific approaches, we might wonder what would be the use of philosophical health practices should we not spontaneously and simply follow our line of life, go with the creel and accept our fate stoically. So perhaps it's because I'm completely fascinating. I don't see anyone writing in the chat, so no one is playing the game. I'm repeating the rules. Please write words that come to your mind as I speak, such that I can then wrap up my talk around your words. So if you don't give me anything, I might just not resonate or be attuned with what you have in mind. Thank you. Now it's happening. In my counseling practice, I often tell my interlocutors that I will try to help them unveil their highest destiny, and then it's up to them to embrace it. This suggests that we may have a plurality of destinies available, such that our social or organic condition can be transcended, sublimated by thoughts, coherent choices, or even systemic choices or epistemic choices. A philosophical stance. The existentialist tradition in philosophy, from Kierkegaard to Sartre, advocates that destiny is a creative project and that we can somewhat generate at least part of the reality we live in. While many people today might accept this idea, it is important to have a conversation on how this might be possible, sustainable, or even epistemically regenerative. I propose that the concept of improvisation, musically understood, can provide a good analogy for the kind of agency that a successful destiny might imply. A musical improvisation is never random. It follows a tonality, a rhythm, and it is a crealectic that is creatively more than dialectic and more than analytic attunement between fidelity and freedom. Fidelity to what? In the philosophical context, each individual can, with some work and courage, unveil a personal conceptual constellation, a set of connected higher principles, for example, justice, creation, listening, or a motto which delivers a personal philosophical tonality. What could be called attuned destinal improvisation then becomes a dual attunement to, on the one hand, our philosophical stance, which should or could be flexibly unshakable, and on the other hand, to the creative variations and gifts of life, such that both excessive wandering and somnolent rigidity are avoided. Fantastic. And I see that we have here a constellation of terms that have popped out of your minds. Attunement to the life that presents itself to us can be prevented by method. So that's actually interesting, because this is what we will talk about. We will talk about how can a method be open enough that it's some sort of tonality, a sort of canvas on which we can then paint with some level of support but not in a way that we become ourselves the machine that reproduces its own methodology. And we've seen that the most brilliant minds in history, I'm thinking of Freud now, tend to fall in this calcification of a rigidification of their methodology. There's a reference to Aristophanes, the cloud, and here I would like to ask Amy. Amy White, do you want to tell us what you were thinking about?
Yeah, you were talking about how philosophy, or has the perception of not really being connected. Kind of in the beginning, you were talking about how it's kind of considered not particularly pragmatically based sometimes. And I was thinking that that is the exact portrait of Socrates in Aristophanes' The Clouds, the man who's up in the clouds while the city is burning, basically. But then as you went on, there's some underlying structure, which I definitely agree with. It shifted, but to start with, that was the thought that came to me.
Right, and what is interesting in that example is that, well, if Socrates was such a aerial character, why kill him, right? That's the paradox there. Akshat, so Raja was the first input, Amy, and now Akshat wrote Destiny and Free Will. And that dialectic, I think, is extremely important today, where I think that we are seeing more and more what I like to call pathologies of free will, in the sense that, well, modernity was constructed, as you all know, in this idea that there is free will and that we can somehow self-determine. That's the ideal of the nation state. Of course, somewhat hypocritical, and hypocritical why? Because more and more today, especially with the movement of automation that's going on, free will becomes problematic if it is to be replaced by machines and artificial intelligence systems who are believed to know better than yourself what you will become. So what becomes of free will if we have a machine that tells us at 15 years old, you should study this discipline because you have 88% chances to succeed and get a job? Philosophical counselor, don't even think about it. There's only one country where it is recognized as a profession. So now, of course, free will needs then to be redefined in the context of the kind of metaphor that I'm proposing. I think that the other aspect of pathologies of free will is that we have insisted very much since the 60s on a form of freedom that takes us back to Plato's cave, of course, in the sense that it equates freedom with the choice of available propositions rather than self-creation. Maria, so A.G. Sade also wrote about freedom. Maria speaks of logos here. I mean, there's so many things about logos, but perspectives. But for me, I think when I hear logos, I think mostly of Heraclitus, who was himself, I think, very conscious and sensitive to the fact that there seems to be a tension between a higher order of the universe that might seem to be somehow predetermined, but at the same time, a dynamic of conflict, of antagonisms in the process of history that actually disbalances the whatever seems to be pre-written. Intriguing, Alice, Marian, inadequate, Edith, acceptance, mindfulness, and even speaks as improvisation as letting the process guide you. So the term of acceptance, I think, is related to that sort of trustfulness in the process. But at the same time, I think it is not, in my view, it is not the kind of popular version of philosophical health that is dominant today through mainstream publications. We seem to privilege, we can discuss that, but in my impression, they seem to privilege the Stoic school. You see a lot of people entering into the world of philosophy via the Stoics. The problem I have with that is that it goes very often along with a message of adaptation to reality. It's sort of a political message of don't rebel too much, accept, you can't change things. It's very conservative politically in the way it's presented. And it forms I wonder if the idea of consolation, withdrawal in itself is the best image that we can offer of what we are helping people to do. Possibility, Anke spoke of semi-consciousness, and it's true that instead of talking about perhaps autopilot or awareness, or as it is trendy in the last decades, mindfulness, right? Of semi-consciousness, like a state where we are in the in-between, a little bit like we are neither deeply inner ourselves, and neither deeply outside. And for me, is actually something that I haven't solved yet in terms of ideal of cognition. Should we aspire to be completely out there in the world, out there in the wild, and like some cognitive scientists recognize that the self is an illusion and that we are just social beings, extended beings, or should we still remain faithful to this idea of the inner self, at least, as I was saying a little bit before, as perhaps an ideal of the self under the form of a motto, for example. So you all know what is a motto, but there is a need today, I haven't found it. If you have that reference, please tell me. There is a need today for a philosophical history of the invention of mottos, or perhaps the reinvention in the Middle Ages in France, where a certain part of the population, privilege, but not always, starting to use this technology of the self, to use a Foucauldian term, of the motto, to do precisely what I'm saying, is like to have some sort of an axis, a sort of an epistemic axis through which we can be open to the variations of destiny. For example, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc's motto was, "In the name of the king in the sky." I'm translating roughly from French. This is extremely interesting. So she was every day repeating this sort of, today we would say mantra, because we forget that a lot of times what we think are Oriental innovations, and there are wonderful things in the Oriental thought, but we tend to forget that European thought also has its mantras under the form of middle-age mottos, but also meditation techniques, etc. So under the name of the God in the sky, that's an example, but this is a wonderful example that allowed Joan of Arc to treat empirical kings, right, secular kings, as equals through that metaphor that, of course, was repeated as a sort of a self-suggestion, which was for her an axis. But as we were seeing before, it's not a method; it's more an orientation, what Hadot calls a deep orientation. Mihail wrote about the choice, and I would like to pause here and ask him, what, in brief words, what do you mean by choose?
This freedom that you talked about in creativity, it's a choice.
Okay, so in the sense of existential choice, perhaps. And here, it's interesting that you made me think of the existentialists, because Amy wrote about jazz, and jazz, of course, jazz is an extremely good example of this kind of conscious improvisation or controlled variation that we could apply as a way of life. Co-creation is a term that I like because of several things, not only because of the importance of collaboration, which is very difficult, and I find there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration. We do collaborate all the time, but we're not even aware that we are collaborating. And then we put all this scaffolding where we say, okay, now we are collaborating, and it makes things sometimes even worse. But by co-creation, I also hear the fact that creation, in my view, should not be considered as an anthropocentric privilege. Creation is the given of life, and we are merely, I would say, pruning that abundance of possibility. Whenever creation is seen as the privilege of humans, we enter in a sort of scheme of production where the earth is this sort of a flat ball that lacks a lot of things, and we need to compensate with overproduction. I'd rather see creation as a doing less with more, the more being the invisible overabundance of the cosmos, which I call Creole. That's why I had the word Creole, it's like the creative real in my reading a bit before. Wow, you really contributed extreme. I wonder if I can do justice to everyone. So existence before essence, of course, which is Sartre's idea, and I won't give you here a lecture on existentialism. Someone is moved out of the meeting, and that's also an interesting form of presence. Some might be in the meeting without being in the meeting. So destiny is as something open, writes Ivan. Yes, of course, not destiny as the idea of hyper premeditation or determinism, which is the philosophical term. Although that might remain an open question. We know that for Spinoza, the only benefit that we could, and which for him was a big benefit, that we could take from philosophical awareness and philosophical health was the understanding of that determinism. So a sort of a enlightened position of spectator. I think that's too extreme. And even if it were true, just the fact that we are not able to be constantly aware of what is given to us, that we are not able to do a reading that optimizes the possibilities, just that makes determinism be reversed. It's like when Hegel was considering the science of phrenology, which was the artificial intelligence of the 19th century, right? They said that if you look at the size of the shape of your brain, etc., locations in the brain, we could reveal who you really are. And Hegel, I think it's in the phenomenology of spirit, has this very interesting and prescient note that he says, well, even if it were true, and he didn't believe that was true, but even if it were true that there was such a science that can allow you to say who someone is now at tea time, not tea and coffee time, but at a given time, that person that you think you understand through phrenology or artificial intelligence will take a decision that will reshuffle things and that will make her or him mysterious again. So I don't know how much time I have left, but we have here, I mean, you've been, maybe the moderator can write to me something like a number that gives me an idea of minutes.
So you have about 20 minutes. So you either it can be used for question answers, or you can continue for a few
right.
minutes.
So the 20 minutes for the questions, right, and comments.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So since I haven't been able to read all your contributions, perhaps we can now include them. I will stop here, and we can, some of you who have written here can perhaps develop their thoughts or their note in the form of a question or of a comment. But I would like just to conclude with what Joanna wrote. She wrote, "Destiny is sublimated by thought," and I think that's a very interesting conclusion because it expresses what I'm trying to say here. It's that, and that resonates to the clouds of you know, the image of the philosopher, or even the image of ideas as being inefficient. I do think that thinking is a social force, and so it has a real impact, and it shapes not only who we are, but our realities. And so that is why what we do as philosophical counselors, it's potentially extremely powerful. Thank you.
Dr. Ivan, you've raised your hand. Do you have a question? So you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. I was trained as an analytic philosopher, so this idea of clarifying concepts, you know, and so I know that your approach is a little bit skeptical about using too much logic and, you know, conceptual analysis. But can you help me wrap my mind a little bit more about this concept that I think you're trying to capture, the concept of attuned destiny or improvisation? You know, how do you trying to use this, you know, this brainstorming, like these concepts that, you know, came out like freedom, you know, determinism, right, you know, existence, persistence, to kind of give a little bit more of a precise characterization of this concept of attuned destiny improvisation. That's the first part of my question. And the second one, how do you think it might be incorporated into philosophical counseling? So let's say I wanted to use this concept that you're trying to develop, right? I mean, to help people, with their specific issues, or to promote their philosophical health, or some other, some of the other goals that philosophical counseling, presents itself as, wanting people to achieve, right? So those are my two.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. And if I may, for me, it's the same question, because when I practice philosophical counseling, I do indeed distinguish three forms of intelligence. And this is not to deprecate one to the benefit of the other. I think the three of them are complementary, but we do live in a world that hypertrophizes analytic intelligence. So when you only focus philosophical counseling in helping people being more analytical, you you give them the poison with the cure. So there is dialectic intelligence, which is also what we do as counselors, of course, just through this dialogic process. But then there's the crealectic intelligence, which for me, and there is there are some papers about it, which you can go deeper. But basically, for me, it's about how do we nurture the possibility for epistemic regeneration through a relationship, first of all, to what I call the creal, so creation. That's like sort of the premise. So it's, Spinoza called it natura naturans, naturing nature. So the first step in my counseling is to help people reconnect with that sense of possibility, which is for me an emotion. For me, creation is a cosmic emotion. And that, of course, does not invalidate that we are, of course, interested in seeing what are the contradictions in the discourse, which can be analytic contradictions, right? We are holding two things that are opposite, and they just create suffering. But the crealectic take is really to reconnect people with that sense of the music of the spheres, and from them on have a wider, if we keep the musical metaphor, have a wider musical range, in the sense that, perhaps that when you came to the philosophical counselor, you were stuck in classical music, which, by the way, I love classical music, or you were stuck in jazz, and now suddenly you start listening, and deep listening for me is one of the pillars of philosophical counseling. You start listening to different forms of music, and it might seem like a cacophony at first, but perhaps then you can recreate new harmonies. So I think that we have to keep in view those three important forms of intelligence and see how we are constantly interweaving them, related to crealectic intelligence. So also our relationship to the sublime, our need for admiration. But I mentioned the term epistemic regeneration. Well, this is not something I will summarize in 5 minutes, but still, there are different layers when we, as a person, or we start talking about our thoughts, our presence in the world. There are layers of, sometimes it's called worldview, etc. There are layers of epistemic coherence that are more or less conscious, that we as philosophical health practitioners can help the person bring, master more, but not in a way that says, this is the right way of thinking. but more in a way that expands the domain of possibilities. So it's a creative relationship to thinking that does not invalidate the analytic thinking, but that tries to show that there are other forms of being in the world. Yes, Akshat.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, sir. It was very unique and people listen to you. The way I see it, it's a very freestyle approach and a very subjective approach that you have here. Is it goal-oriented in any sense?
Right. So it's goal-oriented for the person. I'm not the one who gives the person a goal, but I do agree that, at least in my work, as I said, I help people define their deep orientation. That's the goal, but not to give the person a goal, but to help the person reveal that deep orientation. And noting, by the way, that not everyone is going to get there. So it's not normative in the sense that, well, if you don't find your deep orientation, you are in trouble. Perhaps, but perhaps the process of faithfully remaining in the quest, that is healthy enough. So I wouldn't say freestyle. I would actually say that it's a form of ideally a form of mastery, but again, a mastery that can be compared to, indeed, the metaphor of jazz was but classical music was also highly improvised in Baroque times, so they also had that notion.
Thank you for the insight. So I have a little follow-up question, like how do you market such an approach, or do you market it in any sense? Why would someone approach you? Like,
am I market? It is like am I doing marketing to?
I mean,
well,
like,
I'm going to give you an example because I want to understand your question as what do you do? What kind of people do you work with? So 2 examples. On the one hand, I work with, at the moment, I'm working with people who have spinal cord injury. And the pilot study I'm conducting in partnership with Linköping Hospital is about the philosophy of life of people living with spinal cord injury. So it's about understanding in this condition where suddenly your body is completely changed, right? You are in a wheelchair, but cognitively, most of the time, you are the same. Like you can think, so you need to reinvent your life on the basis that there's no return to normal. I think this is a very good metaphor because today in the world that we are, most people that like us who can walk, who can circulate, many of us live under, or probably not you because you're enlightened, but many people live under the illusion that we are going to return to normal. Oh, there was an economic crisis, but we're going to go back to normal. Oh, there is the climate crisis, but one day we'll be back to normal. Oh, there is COVID, but we'll be back to normal. I think that exactly like people with spinal cord injury, perhaps the entire world now is living in extremis. So we have a lot to learn from people who have managed to recreate their lives in extremis. The other, and I'll give you just another example. And in that case, in those 2 cases, I've been contacted. So I didn't do marketing. So, I mean, yes, I have a site online, etc., but it's more through serendipity. But serendipity, and that's a dimension that I would like to add to the talk I gave, is like, if we are philosophically healthy, we see the propositions of destiny because we have that access, that deep orientation. But if we don't have that, we might actually not even see or hear the propositions that our coherence might attract. So the second people I'm working with is the Swedish multinational Vattenfall. They are responsible for producing the energy, electricity in Sweden, and they use wind power, and so they are fossil free. And I started. I won't develop too much, but I started giving philosophical counseling to given people, head of strategy, etc. But after a while, I had a systemic view of the company, and I told them, well, are you satisfied with that vision, that orientation, fossil free? Isn't that a bit, is that ambitious enough? I mean, can't you see that this, fossil free is a little bit reactive? Can we invent something? And we are in that process now of trying to define a more regenerative approach. But of course, they are engineers, and my role as a philosophical counselor and our role is not to tell them, oh, why don't you do this windmills more like looking like a tree? I actually tell them that, but that's not really what we can help them with. But it's more about having serious epistemic conversations about the thinking or the values or the epistemic foundations of what they're doing. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of water.
Thank you, sir. We have another question by Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen, could you please tell us your question?
I love your, Louis, I really love your analogy, metaphor, with jazz. Jazz, though, with its improvisation, also has certain parameters within which you can play. There's rules about harmony and consonance, dissonance, and notes and the like, timing, and you have to work within those parameters. Sometimes those parameters are more strict than others in different forms of music. Having studied classical guitar, for instance, I remember being very frustrated when I tried to put in a riff, and my instructor said, no, you can't do that. It has to be played just as written. It was somewhat frustrating, but that's the nature of the music. It's very, very strict. So not all music is jazz, and the parameters are looser in some forms of music than in others. If one emphasizes, and this is my question, the creolectic approach here, where we're jazz musicians and we're going to orchestrate our destinies with freestyle. What about those who don't really like jazz? What about those who like Bach, which is, highly mechanized? So how do you respond? Is it just one size needs to fit all, or do you allow for that?
That's a great question. And actually, I sort of pre-answered by mentioning that Bach, as it is played today, is much more rigid than Bach as it was played when Bach was alive. There were a lot of elements of improvisation, exactly like in jazz, based on this very strong spine. And I completely agree with you. That's actually the creolectic method, is that it cannot work if you don't have an epistemic spine or philosophical stance, or so. And then you have the supreme creativity, which is of course under constraints. So that's why it's creolectics. It's like there is a logos, there is a discourse. So it's not, well, it's freestyle, but not in the sense that it's sometimes caricature, right, where anything goes. So I think that's a very good point. Now, let's take your question even more seriously. So nevertheless, there is in classical music, to use that metaphor, or in other practices, very regulated protocols, right? And there's a very interesting book by Benjamin Zander, the conductor, who it's called The Art of Possibility. And so as a conductor of Beethoven and others, he deals with orchestras that he says himself, after a while, they are sort of, they become rigid, right? And even they get bored, because the violins, like the third violins, they play the same. And so all his work is to reanimate, to regenerate the orchestra within the constraints. And he shows that it's possible, even when people think, oh, wait a minute, there is this written piece of music that we must follow. But in fact, he shows very well that what is written is just half of what we can do with music. And I think that's, I hope I didn't convey the idea that it's about anything goes. I hope I conveyed the idea that it is an art of pruning the abundance of possibilities in a way that is faithful to a singular deep orientation.
Yeah, I mean, we've had versions of this discussion before, and it gets us into the question of your approach versus logic-based therapy. But there's actually some harmony between the approaches from this perspective, because when we look at the cardinal fallacies, and that's sort of like the rhythms and the parameters of music that all musicians must conform within, and but that within that sphere of permissible harmonies, there's all different sorts of philosophical perspectives from east to west that one could take. So there's lots of different types of music one could perform, within those logical parameters.
I agree, and I deeply respect the LBT approach, and I think it is an important. I was going to say piece of the puzzle, and I don't think I have the entire puzzle either.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. Yeah.
There is do I have time for Carol or should we wrap it up?
Yeah, unfortunately, the time is up. And this brings us to the end of the third session of today. And the next two sessions will be chaired by Mr. Kevin. So, Mr. Kevin, would you please take over?
All right, let me say some things here. I worked in some time for a break, and we have about 15 minutes